But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's be at it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I've never seen such idiots in all my life.
Listen to all this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's be at it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9.
Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 299. International Women's Day is about what? I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with Nonsense Annihilator Lauren Brooks, who isn't here yet but will be. She's going to be late tonight. And the personification of perceptivity, Mike Stevenson, to take a gander, or would that be a goose, since we're talking about females? Or maybe that's sexual harassment and we shouldn't say it. I don't know. We'll find out.
Authority that, the authority is as good for one as it is for the other.
There we go. We'll find out when the jackboots come after us, right? Anyway, it's Women's History Month, guys, so let's get into it. But before we do, we got to do what we got to do. And what we got to do is a little bit of the evil capitalism. Um, as always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions, and as experiences both recent and long past have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts are fighting back. They've made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party payment platforms like Patreon to fund our work is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly support or encourage our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platform's tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justthetip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can find your way to all of our content, as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page. And also, you can always comment on our posts there, too. So tonight, we were originally going to read more about the totally organic evolution of feminism in academia. But then I remembered it's International Feminism Day tomorrow, so we're going to interrupt that article again, sorry guys, to talk about the totally organic evolution of International Women's Day, because feminism is about gender equality and shit. And there you go. But just a point of order on the blog. We aren't going to remove your comments unless you advocate something illegal, and our folks don't generally do that, right? So... You know, I don't think we have even bothered to moderate spam comments for a while. It got to where it wasn't really, there was no point to it. So, but it, you know, we've had some knockdown, drag-out arguments in that blog, and people might post things that we don't agree with, or they might post things that we do agree with that other people disagree with. You can talk there. And your comments won't be hidden or removed, again, unless we're actually going to get in trouble for them being up, or you might, you know, then that might change things, or you delete them, which has happened also. Like people get into an argument and then they decide they don't want the notifications, and bye argument. But there you go. So, place to have free discussion, and a place to, you know, basically have a mosh pit where people can discuss things without having to deal with working around rules and regulations of social media. But, let's get back to...
Whenever you put a comment on YouTube, be sure to refresh the page and make sure it's still there.
Yeah.
Because very often it will just disappear, and you won't have any idea that it's disappeared unless you refresh the page. Refresh the page in an incognito window just to make sure that that it's not just you seeing it, and that it is in fact being seen by neutral observers. YouTube is a hell site, people. I don't know why any of you are still using it. Please follow us on alternate media.
Definitely. And remember, we are on a lot of other media, and you know, including Rumble, where you can comment on our posts, and I don't think they remove your comments either. So there you go. But definitely, yeah, if you comment on any of our videos here, and I've actually had to whitelist people who have made completely innocuous comments under our posts, like not even political, just description of, you know, this is talked about at this point in the video, and that's talked about at that point in the video, and here's a link to where we've published or you know, something that's referencing the video, and so on, and you know, YouTube hides it. So it's a lot of fun, like trying to figure out what they want us to do, what they don't want us to do, and then ignoring it. You know, but yeah. Let's get on to International Women's Day, which is, as you all know, going to be endured throughout the day by many tomorrow. And the article starts out, it's kind of interesting. The socialist origins of International Women's Day. Why is International Women's Day on March 8th? The answer is much more complicated than you think. And I kind of like the picture because it looks... it's from a International Women's Day poster from 1914, and it kind of looks like everything... communists and socialists put up for people to look at, and like, here we are, this is what we're doing now, ever. It's got the same...
It's conspicuously red and yellow themed.
Yeah, it's got the same ugly color scheme, same imposing appearance, you know. The same, you know, this woman doesn't look cute and bubbly and feminine. She looks like she's about to kick your ass by beating you to death with that flag.
But I'm not going to complain about that. I mean, that's if anything, more respectable, and in some ways more attractive than the bubbly little fucking OnlyFans girls who represent feminism nowadays.
Yeah,
that's
but it's
far
clearly
more insidious.
It's clearly not made to be appealing. Right? It's this. I always look at these types of posters that come from history, and you look at what communists and socialists put up everywhere, and the poster is almost an assault on the senses. It's like it's intended to be an assault on the senses, and this kind of goes right along with that.
Protest is supposed to make people uncomfortable. To paraphrase AOC, a principle that has bitten her on the ass recently more than once.
Yeah, you know, you have to be careful about that, though. I mean, like, even though she originates the things that bite her on the ass, at some point she's gonna find a way to Me Too somebody else over it. It is obviously sexual harassment to go around biting federal legislators on the ass, even if it is their own ideas that are doing it.
You might even call it genocide.
Well, you know, it's definitely cannibalism. All right, so let's get started here. There we go. In 1987, March was designated as Women's History Month in the United States. So this has been a long time, right? 1987, we're back to the time period just a little bit before the other article we've been reading about the history of women's studies was written, sort of denoting tracing how women's studies evolved. By 1987, when Women's History Month was designated, women's studies was a fairly widely existing area of study, and not just area of study, but there was a specific major to it. So it wasn't like you couldn't say, well, I'm generally studying languages, but I'm majoring in this particular set of languages or this particular language. Women's studies was like that. You can say, I'm studying sociology in general, but women's studies is my major. And you could be taken seriously by 1987, stating that you were majoring in women's studies. And you could come out of that, you could expect to get jobs after majoring in women's studies by 1987. You come out of women's studies, you start applying around at human resources departments, you start applying around at the shelters that existed before the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 that feminists credit with getting them started, and you're quite likely to get hired, and not only get hired, but make a middle-class income. Definitely more than a teacher was making. So there you go. So Women's History Month.
The mid 1980s was the point where I'd say the worm had completely turned, but that was suggested there was a worm to be turned. Society has always been, well, throughout history, recordable history has always been gynocentric to some reason, some way or another. But the mid 1980s was, for instance, the point where female students overtook male students as the majority of university applicants and indeed successful applicants. In fact, we can trace it to round about 1984, which is just a funny coincidence.
Yeah.
But beyond that wasn't the point where the feminists stopped and went, okay, now we have parity. Now we have 50-50, we can stop. No, young Bucky. No, it hasn't stopped since then. Feminists never ask themselves, when have we gone too far? And they still will never ask themselves that, because it's not in their vocabulary. It never has been, because it never has been a movement for equality. It's been a movement for female supremacy, as all the graphs will illustrate. And why do we still have the International Women's Day when it's already been extended to International Women's Month? What's the point in having a day when it's just one of 31 days that are now International Women's Days? It's going to become a whole year at some point, and people are going to call it International Women's Year, and literally every year is going to be International Women's Year, while they continue to insist that every day is International Men's Day, even though the vast majority of people have no idea when International Men's Day is, because no one celebrates it. No one even acknowledges it except us space lepers out here in MRA land.
Well, and the feminists that are trying to take it over and make it socialist as well. So, and that's been going on for. You have this dualism, this sort of dual response to International Men's Day from feminists. A large number of them object to it, right? And then the other half try to use it as a means of promoting feminist narratives about men, right? They'll promote the toxic masculinity narrative. They start talking about using it as a day to castigate all men for domestic violence and, like, for intimate partner and sexual violence. They crow about different statistics that they've put forth and everything, and insist that this should be a day of reform for men, or they use it to paint men as idiots and address something that hasn't been said in a long time, which is when is International Men's Day? How come there's an International Women's Day? Like, there might be a few people who live in a cave that don't have an awareness of International Men's Day, but really it's pretty well known at this point that the day exists. But if you want it to not become a feminist day of man-shaming, MRAs really do need to maintain male control of that holiday. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and continue looking here at the article. So, like I said, the time period that during when Women's History Month was designated as an official holiday month in the United States was one when it was common already for women to be able to major in a solipsistic area of study and then get a job based on graduating from a women's studies major, and use that job to propel themselves into the middle class.
Namely, HR.
Yep. Two areas really were kind of dominated by women's studies majors: human resources at that time, and social services. So, like, you could major in women's studies and become a caseworker, for various things. All you had to do is take some other classes to to become certified as a social worker. And you could become a caseworker. You could become a child support collection agent, also known as caseworker, or you could become a caseworker for women alleging abuse. You could go to work for an organization that supports women alleging rape. You could go to work in police departments as part of the support system for women alleging abuse and rape. So there were a lot of jobs. People always are like, yeah, you want fries with that? Women's studies degree? But the fact is, it's actually quite lucrative, and that's why the area of study has continued to exist all this time, because it is a source of income for a lot of women. And then the other thing that they do, and this sort of started like 1987, the year 1987 was the year Mary P. Koss published her report on the prevalence of rape on university campuses that became the template for feminist rape prevalence studies, where they instead of using crime stats or asking direct questions about women's experiences, they asked indirect questions and then interpreted them to mean these women were raped, and then published statistics that were disagreed with by 75% of their, or 74% of their respondents. And, it basically created a whole new area. Consent training, rape prevention training, universities started to hire people to come in and do orientation type classes where like your entire freshman class would have to attend this. I remember having to attend something like that when I started university, and I went to a very conservative campus. And I had to attend it was offered multiple times so that, you could work your classes around it. But I had to attend, they called it, I think, a seminar or something like that, but we didn't all get to talk on rape prevention and consent. And the enthusiastic consent standard that we hear about today wasn't named back then, but it was described and discussed. And, of course, also, all of the admonitions, don't take sexual advantage of somebody who's been drinking and so on, which is funny because it was on a dry campus. But these were based on materials that the student organization that held the seminar paid for. Those materials were bought, or access to those materials were bought, and the income from that access to those materials went to the creator of those materials, which would be an individual who majored in women's studies and minored in graphic design, or vice versa. So these areas, these types of things have quite a bit of income potential for feminists. And it was quite a lucrative prospect to be able to go in and say, hey, your students at your university may not be aware that it's rape to act sexually upon a person who is incapacitated by an intoxicant. And the boomers who ran the university would be like, oh my gosh, our students are ignorant. We have to educate them on this topic. And then they would pay, to get these materials. And it worked every time. All the universities in the United States pretty much did this. So we're talking hundreds of campuses. The hundreds of campuses that had women's studies courses also had this stuff going on. And the campuses that didn't have women's studies courses, like my campus, home economics was women's studies on my campus, they also did this. And that's the context in which Women's History Month was designated as an official holiday month. The month of March was chosen because it incorporated International Women's Day, March 8th. The story of how International Women's Day came to be, however, is convoluted, to say the least.
Lol.
Lol, yeah. As historian Timma Kaplan writes, International Women's Day has its origins in socialism and the conditions of working women. And we may look at that article as well on another day this month, because this is interesting to me. How many people think that the day evolved organically as a celebration of women, as people, and women's contributions to society, and a means of addressing women's issues? Because clearly, if it's just about socialism and the conditions of working women, it's not about those other things. It's about socialism. It is an inroad for socialism.
You would think socialism and communism would focus mainly on men, because men are and always have been the majority of workers. And I say the majority because, yes, women have always had jobs. Some of them have been under whatever government makes them have jobs, but largely they were domestic jobs. For the entirety of history, women have had at least a domestic analog of a job, but men have been the ones who have had jobs that have been driven by agriculture or industry or whatever is being driven at the time. So you would think that especially the earliest iterations of socialism would mainly focus upon men and their struggles as workers. But weirdly enough, no. Ever since its early iterations, it's been like, think of the poor whammons.
Yeah.
Some of them have hands that are all knackered. There was this some anecdote about some socialist leader who met a bunch of women, and he said, "Show me your hands," and one of them showed her hands, and they were all gnarled and covered in scars and shit. Anyway, these are beautiful hands. These are workers' hands, and that was held up as this mythological socialist story. And I'm like, look at the hands of any given man, especially back in those days.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of hands that men have always had. I mean, until very recently, and even recently, most men have hands like that. If that's the analogy you're going to work with. Like, socialism, but by all accounts, should have been a men's rights movement, but it never was, and it still isn't. It's the women's rights movement, because it's always been a self-contradictory movement that actually paints the bourgeoisie as the proletariat and vice versa.
It's because if you want to persuade people to adopt a set of ideas, you show how they benefit women. You show how women are important to them, or you show how women are important within them. Because women have always been important to men. Right? It's just a bottom line thing. Men have throughout history made a major focus of their lives finding a wife and raising a family, no matter what else they were doing. And it was always outliers within society who didn't want that or didn't strive for it. Not necessarily outliers who didn't succeed at it, but outliers who didn't strive for it. And that actually has a lot to do with work, because women working and men working had different social pressures involved in the work that they chose and the work that they did and the degree to which they were dedicated to their jobs and so on. And they also had different motivations, right? Men have always had, in terms of their whatever their work was, whether it was, industrial age, working for someone else, or whether it was building their own business during the pre-industrial age, sort of renaissance of you can specialize in this one type of work and people will come to you for that, or whether it was before technology created so much work that men could do to help other people not have to do it themselves. Men engaging in agriculture and hunting and so on. That was always a means of supporting wife and family. And you were always viewed as less of a man if you weren't motivated to do that, to support wife and family. You were either less of a man, or you were weird, or you were sacrificing an essential aspect of male satisfaction with life for some other form of greatness that would compete with it too much. The few men who did some great heroic thing and never married because they were completely caught up in that one great heroic thing they were doing, or men who isolated themselves from community and family life in order to practice a religious viewpoint and actually train themselves in religious philosophy to the degree that everything else was excluded. But women have always been, their income's always been either supplemental to the family out of need or desperation, or it's been self-serving. And it's not been, you don't get viewed as less of a woman for failing to earn money to support your family. Right? You might get viewed as a burden on your family, but you won't get viewed as something to be shamed. You might be viewed as disabled or having a difficult time, a victim of the situation, right? And it was just not a similar thing. So because of that, women have always been exempt from the pressures that led men to do jobs that were dangerous, dirty, hard, horribly boring. Like, there are some positions in security that you have no real mental stimulation going on and no physical activity in the job. So it's essentially however many hours of watching for something to happen in an environment where nothing's going to happen most of the time. And you still have to be on alert the whole time. And then there's other jobs that are very taxing because you have to focus intently on small details or complicated things that are very mentally draining. Those are all jobs that men are driven to do in order to support their families, in order to support their lifestyles, in order to support their children. But women haven't been historically driven to do. And the other thing is, there's a history of, if a man is in economic distress, society views him as a threat or an inconvenience. When a woman is in economic distress, society views her as a victim and a project, right? Someone that needs their help. And unfortunately, that has also created a circumstance of men being under pressure to never be in that situation, regardless of what happens to them, and women having safety nets that kind of prevent greatness in women by preventing women from being pressured to never be in that situation, regardless of what happens to them. So, yeah. So the idea of conditions of working women, it's interesting that became a focus. And I would say the reason it became a focus was because of gynocentrism, not because working women had it in particular rough in comparison to working men, because really they didn't. And yes, Jen Bottle, religion did play a big part in getting married. I think pair bonding was a thing regardless, and I think society would have figured out something in order to keep the peace, because if you have competition, sexual competition taking place and violence in regard to that sexual competition, you end up with chaos in your society. So if religion hadn't stepped in, government probably would have anyway. But, yeah, religion stepped in first. Religion also stepped in before government when it came to dealing with issues of poverty and bad luck, bad situations, results of choices that were unwise and stuff like that. And when religion dealt with those issues, the goal was to get people back on their feet, to get them back on the right path for their lives and so on. And it wasn't necessarily to just fund those types of lifestyles. But after government took that over, that sort of changed, and it became a means of funding failure and habitual failure. And then it became expensive, and government started creating poor laws and ways to go after family members and so on. That wasn't really something that the church did. And, as a result, you end up with a repeated pattern, I guess, throughout the history after it became a government thing to financially support habitual failure, where they create something in terms of the English poor laws, something similar to that every so many years. They support the failure becomes expensive, the failure becomes catastrophically expensive and detrimental to the advancement of civilization. The government starts handing out these ideas of punishment in order to sort of discourage that habitual failure. And it doesn't work, but it does look like it's abusive to people. And a lot of whining takes place, and a lot of those measures get turned off or, ended or whatever. And then the cycle continues. And it's all basically because we can't hold women accountable when they make those kind of choices. But yeah, working conditions for women. Kaplan acknowledges the importance of secular communal holidays for 19th century socialists, communists, and anarchists, citing Bastille Day, May Day, and various anniversaries of the Paris Commune. These holidays were more about solidification and a sense of community than the actual date they fell on. That said, it's worth noting how oddly complicated the history of this holiday is, complete with invented backstories and shifting dates. Here's the chronology. So we're going to go back to 1857, March 8. A women textile workers strike does, or maybe not, happen in New York City. As Kaplan's article explains, the origin of International Women's Day was a story I have recounted, or have had recounted to me numerous times, and therefore know well. A spontaneous demonstration staged by New York City women garment and textile workers in 1857, protesting low wages, the 12-hour workday, and increasing workloads, was dispersed by the police rather brutally. She goes on to reveal, however, that French scholars have called this origin story into question, suggesting that the strike was invented retroactively, rewriting history, as a way to give the holiday a compelling, non-socialist backstory. So the origin story of International Women's Day is probably a lie. That's what we just established.
It seems it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that people started noticing that women were having a hard time as well.
Mm-hmm.
Despite, people like to say that women have always been the gatherers, whereas men have always been the hunters. In reality, men have always been the hunter-gatherers, and women have filled in a supplemental role as gatherers. But I guess this could not this such a differentiation could no longer be drawn when it came to the Industrial Revolution, because men and women were both working in factories, doing very different jobs, obviously, because women were mostly spinsters, or working the looms and the spinning wheels, while men were pushing the heavy equipment.
Yep.
Around, but yeah.
And that's also why it was up until 1963, it was legal to pay a woman less in the same position, because a lot of times there were things that she wasn't expected to do because she was not a man. Unlike, the equally existing standard, it was also legal to pay a black person less, even though a black person doesn't necessarily do any different level of work that would justify that reduced pay. So the Equal Pay Act was actually initiated, it was created to remedy that situation, because they were doing the same work for less pay, as opposed to women who were doing less work for less pay. But now you have to pay men and women the same if they have the same job title, even if they don't do all of the parts of that job, or even if there are expectations on men that are not part of the job description. For example, heavy lifting. And probably the weirdest example I can give is when I was at university, I dated a house tech, which is like a nurse's aide for a local hospital. And one night, this was in Lima, one night they had a gang execution that initially failed. So they had the victim of the execution was taken to the hospital with his carotid artery severed. And there's not really a chance of survival in that situation. But they tried anyway. The hospital tried. Everybody that worked with that patient just beat the hell out of themselves trying to prevent his death. And ultimately they couldn't. And his friends and family mobbed the hospital. And as soon as the report of his death went out, the parking lot was filled with people. And the grounds around the front of the building where there was no parking, that was covered. And what the hospital did, they had their security, and there were police there. But they also had all of the male nurses and all of the male house techs man the exterior doors to guard them, so that nobody could get in and do any harm to the female employees and the patients. And so he spent all night on his night shift on guard duty, looking out at people who were enraged that the hospital had failed to do the impossible in the case of this young man. And, I don't know the backstory on his execution, but what I do know is the hospital wasn't at fault for it. And certainly not the men who worked there, who, he did that after struggling to save that kid's life, and not being able to save him. So, none of the women were expected to do that. That's not actually listed in the job description of a house tech or a nurse or any other male employee of the hospital. It's not on the security team. But they were made to do it. And if they had refused, they would have been written up for insubordination and subsequently fired. So yeah, when women complain that when women work, they get paid less, I think about things like that, because I don't think women understand, for the most part, what it's like to be the person who's going to get thrust into that situation. I didn't take a security job here. Why am I standing in this doorway looking out at these people who are on the verge of attacking this hospital? Right? No woman has ever had to think that. Or if one has, it's been because there hasn't been a man around and she was the biggest girl in the area. But yeah, that's basically, my favorite example because it's so stark and dark. So let's say in July 1889, in Kaplan's reading The Real Story of International Women's Day, yes, singular, Woman's Day in its first iteration, began when Clara Zetkin, the editor of the German Social Democratic Party's women's newspaper, hopefully I don't butcher this, Gleichheit, hopefully that's correct, sorry if it's not, attended a Bastille Day meeting in Paris. The leftist groups assembled there called for a May Day demonstration for workers' rights. Zetkin was inspired and began to lay the groundwork to eventually establish International Women's Day as a communist holiday. Notably, Kaplan writes that Zetkin was a virulent opponent of feminists inside and outside her party, but she was concerned with the rights of female workers. So she was a feminist anti-feminist. Like, I see this stuff, and I read it, and I'm like, all right, feminism is based on the gender-wide, demographic-wide allegation that women are oppressed by men as a population who have kept them down by by designing society in ways that hinder women's advancements and hinder women's freedoms for no reason. Like no benefit to women, and no real benefit other than men getting power over women, right? That's the allegation that feminists have. And if you look at allegations in regard to discrimination against female workers, it's pretty much the same thing, right? Businesses discriminating against female workers would really fail in terms of they wouldn't be able to get women to work for them, in a situation where the economy wasn't completely tanked, right? Where the economy was decent, and people had what they needed to use the shopping system. You wouldn't have an issue of finding jobs. If you didn't like who you were working for, you could work somewhere else, right? But the argument that female workers are uniquely oppressed in comparison to male workers, that they are uniquely discriminated against, is the argument that a patriarchal society has designed the environment of the workplace in a way that oppresses women to no benefit to women and for no good reason, right? So it's feminism. It's the same argument. There's nothing different about it.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm not a feminist, but I do think women need more rights and men need fewer rights, and I call this equality. And yeah, the same shit's happening these days, especially with people all across the political spectrum. I think feminism is over. You'll need to stop talking about feminism. You'll need to stop blaming feminism for everything. Now there's far more important things to talk about, like this trans issue, as though that's not a direct result.
It's an outcropping.
It's not even an outcropping. It's still the same thing.
It's
it's stage 4 cancer instead of stage 1 cancer, and people are talking about it like it's not cancer. No, it's the same. Just because you don't call it feminism doesn't mean it doesn't have all the same hallmarks, all the same attributes as this phenomenon has always had. In fact, communism and feminism, as we're discovering in this article, have always been, I don't even want to say different heads of the same hydra. It's a hydra with one head. It's a massive fucking dragon, and that's all it's ever been. It preys on the people who actually have no power, namely men, on behalf of the people who actually have all the applicable power, namely women. Just because you call it something else doesn't mean it's a different thing.
Yeah.
Why can't people get their heads around this? Ugh.
Yep. And it's sad because if we could get rid of this notion, this patriarchal oppression idea, right? That this has been throughout history. The male population has designed civilization to hold women back for men's benefit at women's expense, right? That idea, if that idea could just die, and people could see through it, realize how stupid it is, abandon it, and then start looking at things with open eyes, we could get rid of a whole bunch of different ideologies that are currently tearing the first world apart. But for some reason, and I can tell you what it is. We seem to have a continual feed of people, even if they've seen the light a little bit, dropping back into that victim mentality and wallowing in it and choosing to go back there and choosing to wallow in it and remain there. Like, oh, it was fun being a tough gal for a while, or it was fun being a Chad for a while, but it's a lot easier for me to settle back into this victim narrative and fit in with society, right? But in terms of women who do it, there's a lot of power in exercising one's female victimhood in society. There's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of an ability to convince oneself that one is not missing out or failing on things one should be achieving or enjoying in life based on one's own failures. If one is missing out, it's somebody else's fault, so you don't have to feel bad about it. It's not, oh gosh, I fucked up and now I don't get this great result. It's, this other person victimized me and now I don't get this great result. Now I'm going to work up a good mad and shame them for it and then move on with my life with a clear conscience that I did nothing to myself. It was all their fault. And I think a lot of it is that shortcut mentality and that sort of defensiveness against feeling like you fucked up. But yeah. So, communism and feminism, not really two separate things. March 8, 1907. This date is accepted by many Europeans as the inaugural International Women's Day, allegedly started to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the aforementioned textile workers' strike, of which there is no real evidence. Kaplan notes that this odd shifting around of dates and origin stories is a result of long-standing conflict between feminists and communists over whether women have rights beyond those they hold as workers. So it's an interesting conflict, because when you talk about communism with a man who is a communist, and I've done that quite a bit, you start talking about human rights, the first thing they do is start denying that human rights are a thing. Like, you don't have a right to life. Why do you have a right to life? What right do you have to live? Prove this right exists. And, it goes on that sort of tangent. And same thing with bodily autonomy, same thing with the right to, independence of any kind, voting rights, all that. if it's not connected to your status as a worker and your role as a worker, communist men do not acknowledge rights. But communist women do.
They're not your rights, they're our rights.
That's right. And that's the point. So when feminists, start talking about other rights, bodily autonomy, things like abortion and stuff like that they try to shoehorn into bodily autonomy, even though there's a second body there they don't want to talk about. Communism doesn't have space for that. But yet communists still manage to create holidays to celebrate women. And communism does use celebration of women as a means of getting women to comply with communist takeovers of their nations, right? Like, how many people have heard the phrase, women hold up half the sky, and thought, who holds up the other half? So, 1907.
Trans women, right?
Trans women. August 1907, under Zetkin's leadership, a group of socialist women met in Germany to discuss how to publicize their goals of equality. March 8, 1908, New York City's Social Democratic Women's Society held a large meeting on women's suffrage. So again, we're socialists here. So women's suffrage has a bit of connection with socialism. This was significant because it marked a shift. Previously, American and European socialists and suffragists had been politically at odds with each other. Now they began to express solidarity.
The vote is a bit like the safety net that we were talking about earlier on. Now, you can argue that a safety net is a good thing. It isn't necessarily a good thing, but you can argue that it is. But if you do, you kind of have to give it to men and women. If you don't think a safety net is a good thing, then you can't give it to men or women. And this is a problem we keep coming across. If women need a safety net, then so do men. But a safety net is much like the welfare state. It on paper or on the surface, it seems like something that can only possibly improve lives, but in practice, it kind of doesn't, because without that safety net, people would learn to actually stay on the trapeze, not fall. And it's much the same with the vote. People are like, well, if men have the vote, they didn't for the longest of history. It was only the upper class and maybe the upper middle class who had the vote. And eventually people went, well, if they're going to have the vote, then women should have the vote as well. No one ever asked themselves, maybe nobody should have the vote. Maybe having the vote in the first place was what led us down this garden path into the dark half of that meme. You know, the meme where there's the dark path to the left and the bright path to the right, which is illustrative of what the left means and what the right means.
Yeah.
Has it ever occurred to you that women shouldn't have the vote and men shouldn't have the vote either? Maybe we were better off when this was never an option.
Well, before suffrage, you know what the vote was, right? It was the torch and pitchfork mob that would show up at the castle and drag the king out and get rid of him. Hang him, behead him, whatever. Or the emperor or the dictator of whatever type you choose. If the decisions of the executive leader of a large territory were detrimental to the public to the degree that the public found them insufferable. And that happened over and over again throughout history. Like, that's a vote. Everybody voted no confidence, and no confidence took the form of a rope, a fire, a blade, a gun. Throughout history there have been different, throwing somebody off of a cliff, different means by which, if a leader was really lucky, they just exiled them, right, to another country where they were not wealthy to the degree that they had been in their own for the rest of their lives. But and men and women participated in that together, right? And then in terms of voting history, people think of voting as something that men just always had, but they didn't. For the longest time, there was no vote, besides, revolution. And when voting rights sort of evolved, it was something that started with the men who were responsible for sections of the leader's territory. So, knights or lords or barons or, various terms for people who served under the monarch, the dictator, the whatever name you have for your dictator, as faithful loyalists who would oversee large territories and maintain peace and order within those territories. They were the only people that had voting rights. And when it expanded to more and more landowners and heads of smaller and smaller territories within those bigger territories, it was on the basis of having responsibility for territory that was land territory, and also territory that was economic territory. And that was changed for the ability to give women the vote. And it's something that never gets talked about in terms of suffrage. It never gets discussed how voting rights evolved as a means for people in positions of economic responsibility and leadership over segments of a population to contribute to the decision-making process that would affect their ability to do their jobs and the people under their authority and their responsibility and their care. Women didn't have that as voters. Women never really had that as voters en masse. A few women may have had enough money to their names and enough power to their names to qualify for that. But it was not women being denied voting rights just on the basis of their sex when men had them just on the basis of theirs. That never happened. That's a historical lie that is based on ignoring the difference between what men were responsible for throughout history and what women were responsible for throughout history. And so when women started exercising their voting rights, they didn't exercise them the way an individual would who got their right to contribute to that decision-making process as a cog in the wheel of the machine that ran the country. They did it. They did their voting as recipients of the benefits of that machine, and that is why we see so many women voting for Gibbs. That is the underlying cause.
So whenever we hear the Democrat Party, it's not as ironic or inapplicable as it sounds that they call themselves the Democrat Party. Whenever we hear shills of the Democrat Party call us an existential threat to their democracy, we're kind of compelled to go, well, what they really mean is we're a threat to the hegemony of the Democrat Party, we're a threat to their power. Because we're scrambling for anything other than that we actually are a threat to democracy. Because we don't want to be called a threat to democracy. Because we love democracy and everything. Maybe we're barking up the wrong tree there. Maybe we're just playing into their hands. what exactly is wrong with being a threat to democracy? Maybe we should be leaning right into that description and say, hell yes, we are a threat, not just to whatever you're calling your democracy. We're actually a threat to democracy because we've come to the conclusion that democracy is the god that failed. The democracy's had a few centuries of hegemony, and it's not working. It's finally coming to a head where democracy has become a system far more totalitarian than any monarchy ever has been. The kind of shit that's happened in the last few years as a result of a democratic system across the West is far more unbelievably despotic than any monarchy ever has been. So consider that, friends. Consider that you should be a threat to democracy. Consider that you could advocate for an alternative. And that could be monarchy. It could be an actual republic for those countries out there who are supposed to be constitutional republics, or indeed constitutional monarchies. That covers your country and my country, Hannah. Neither of us are supposed to be democracies.
No, we're not.
Yeah, and yet we keep capitulating to these twat bags who keep saying you're a threat to our democracy. Yeah, we are. We're not democracies. We never have been. So stop trying to play us like we are. We want something else. We want the rule of law, whether it's a rule by, documents that we've written out that you're supposed to be following, or maybe even by a figurehead like a monarch who we are perfectly willing and able to behead should they fuck up too much. Because if that's the only option we have, then we're far more likely to resort to that option. If the monarch does shit we don't like, then there's way more of us than there are of them. There's literally one of them, and there's millions of us. So we're far more able and far more likely to take up arms against that one person, even if they do happen to have a Queen's Guard full of people with fucking animals on their heads or whatever. And democracy creates this illusion that we have power, that we can just vote, and that will somehow change things for 4 years. When it doesn't change anything. It just puts someone else in the wind cage where they can grab as much money as possible for 4 years before someone else is in power, and then they have to evade any accountability for another 4 years, and none of it even matters. At what point do we say, yeah, this isn't working? Democracy isn't working. Can we maybe try something else? We can at least start by maybe electing an ANCAP, like they did in Argentina. That would be a good start.
I like that idea. I really like that idea. The old saying about democracy being two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner is 100% true. And I don't want to be either the wolf or the sheep.
And that adage, I think, has been apocryphally applied to Churchill, like so many have.
I don't know who actually said it.
That democracy is the worst system ever devised, apart from all the other ones.
Yeah.
No, it's not true. It's literally the worst system ever devised. It just happens to take centuries before it realizes its true potential as the worst evil ever committed upon the world.
Democracy only works if everyone in the democracy is both wise and ethical. And unfortunately, that's not the real world. Most people aren't both at the same time, if they are one or the other. They're not, if they're one, they're definitely not the other. And it's sad. it's not that they're the antithesis of each other. Like, I've run into people who are both wise and ethical, and I've run into people who are very wise and very ethical, but a lot of people are very short-sighted, and they mistake compassion and simple compassion, sympathy, for ethics, and it's not the case. So,
it's not even that people are stupid; it's that people can be easily led by a consensus, and we happen to live in an age where people don't just live their own lives with their own families and their own localized jobs. We live in an age where people sat glued to the television almost all day, every day, assuming they're being told the truth by this goggle box. And
well,
yeah,
and
it's very easy to control people and to divide people when they're paying more attention to this screen that's regulated by government propaganda. They're far more interested in that than they are in their own personal lives.
you also have an issue of people failing to engage their logic functions when they are responding emotionally to something. So you run into a person, for instance, that has hit rock bottom and they're in severe economic distress, and they have serious problems in their lives, and maybe they're addicted to something, and they're homeless, or they're about to lose everything they have or whatever because of that. A lot of people want to just throw money at the situation when the individual needs a little bit of money and a lot of social support. And there's a little bit of laziness in wanting to just throw money and not offer the social support, but there's also a lot of immediate, like when you hear a person crying or when you see someone suffering, your first, if you have a heart, your first impulse is to want to solve the immediate situation, and then you feel like you've done it when you solve the immediate situation. So, you give somebody a meal or you give somebody a few bucks, you've done something, right? But if the individual is in even more desperate need of social support to improve their situation, than they are in need of a few bucks or a meal, then you've sort of thrown your concerns and your resources into the void. And tomorrow they're going to be in the same situation, and it's not going to get any better. And when people apply that in terms of democracy, you end up with social safety nets that support habitual failure, that discourage getting out of that hole, like to the degree that you go for help when you're in a temporary but very inconvenient situation, and you get the help you need, and then you find a way to improve your situation, and you go back and you say, thank you very much, I can graduate from this system, you helped me, and I'm back on my feet, and I don't need any more help, so you have my gratitude. And you go to walk away, and they're like, well, if you divorce your husband, you can still continue to collect these benefits. Right? And you're like, well, what? Why would you tell me that? Why would you encourage that? What the fuck is wrong with you? Well, they're part of a system that relies on your habitual failure in order to justify their jobs. And their goal, they may not even be malicious in attempting to cause this. Like, you would think, how could you not be malicious when you say you should divorce your husband? But a lot of these people believe that marriage is a trap for women, that You don't need that. You can get divorced and still be in love and still be together and all that stuff, and it'll be just fine. Nothing will go wrong with that. You're not going to cheat. You're not going to be less dedicated and all that. And maybe that's fine. Maybe don't get married in the first place if you're going to have that attitude toward your relationship. That's your business, all right? But it's still weird advice, right? And then the other thing is, obviously, they're talking about the breakup of a family on paper in order to continue milking a system. They might feel like they're doing the individual a favor, right? You don't have to lose this income. You can keep this income, just, lie about your economic status. But really, they're encouraging unethical behavior and reliance on handouts. And it's that they may feel like they're helping, and they may not think about it hard enough to realize that it's the opposite, that they're being enablers, just the same as when you pay an addict's electric bill, and then they feel like they can go out and buy more heroin because, well, this month you paid their electric bill, so maybe next month you will too. Right? So it is quite a situation of malicious draining, and that's what we end up with as a result of. We've ended up with this as a result of women's participation in systems of government, but we've ended up with it even more so as a result of systems of government in general. Right? You don't have welfare if you don't have a government. But again, going back to the paragraph that we read and what started all of this, and remind you, socialists and suffragists had been politically at odds with each other, and they began to express solidarity over women's suffrage. Why? Because women were more likely to want to usher in socialism, government control of the means of production and the distribution of the product. To benefit women, of course. February 1909, American Socialists declared the last Sunday in February as National Women's Day. Sunday was chosen as it was the only day working people had off, because we used to have a 6-day work week in the U.S. A meeting in New York City focused on equal rights and women's suffrage. So again, there they are. They're on women's suffrage. Addressing a Brooklyn audience, Charlotte Perkins Gilman said, "It is true that a woman's duty is centered in her home and motherhood, but home should mean the whole country and not be confined to 2 or 3 or to 3 or 4 rooms or a city or a state." I want to point out here, I don't think the concept of a woman's duty has been discussed as a political idea probably in my entire lifetime. Men's duty, yeah. Men's duty to support their families, men's duty to support their communities, to contribute to their communities, men's duty to defend their countries, to be prepared to defend their countries. But women's duty? I haven't heard word one about that outside my parents' house. It was just not a thing. I don't know if women even have a sense of duty anymore. March 18th, 1911. The first International Women's Day was held in Europe, focused on women's rights and suffrage. The date was chosen because it was the anniversary of the Paris Commune. Women marched and demonstrated all across Europe. Americans continued to celebrate the last Sunday in February. World War I, however, ended all possibility for social reform for 5 years. It's hard to be bitching about women's situations when all the men are off in trenches getting shot at.
It's hard, but they did it anyway.
Yeah. They were busy handing out white feathers. February 1913. To celebrate Women's Day, Russian Bolshevik women marched to protest poor living conditions, high rents and food prices, and widespread layoffs. They chose the last Sunday of February to celebrate the day American style. March 7, 1915. Zetkin gathered socialist women for anti-war demonstration. February 1917. In the name of Women's Day, Russian Bolshevik women took to the streets again, and when the Russian army was ordered to shoot the strikers, the events that led to the February Revolution began. 1922. After the war, the formerly socialist Zetkin became communist. Gosh, but socialism is totally not communist light, and it's definitely not the gateway drug to communism. Except in her case. Zetkin worked with Vladimir Lenin to establish International Women's Day, March 8th, as a communist holiday. It was also celebrated in communist China and Spain. The holiday remained associated with communism for some decades. A 1932 Soviet poster proclaims 8th of March is the day of rebellion of the working women against kitchen slavery. Down with the oppression and narrow-mindedness of household work. So that whole idea that the kitchen is a place of oppression for women came from communism. Feminism took that directly from communism. And in the 40s and 50s in the United States, it spread around this idea that women were trapped in there, that they were prisoners of the kitchen, that they were oppressed by being in the kitchen instead of having to go out into the workplace like men and do jobs for money. And, you know, honestly, like I've never been a homemaker that was just only a homemaker in my adult life. I did a lot of things that homemakers do when I was in school, in support of my mom, doing things that the family had discussed and agreed that, you know, we would all be willing to participate in this and be part of this, and pick up homemaking activities and tasks in order to support this. And that included our family business, which, you know, back in the day, there wouldn't even have been a discussion. Before the Industrial Revolution, it wouldn't have been photography, obviously, because that hadn't been invented yet, but whatever my parents had decided to do as their family business, which probably would have been what their parents had done, so we would have been farmers, there wouldn't have been this discussion about, are the kids going to step up as teenagers and become part of the homemaking part of the household so that mom and dad can do the work of the family business together. That just would have been the norm. And in fact, we would have been, as we did, learning the family trade. And there wouldn't have been a, the woman's job is just in the kitchen discussion there. There was no, that wasn't a thing until the industrial age. But yeah. Down with the oppression and narrow-mindedness of household work came right out of communism. And a lot of what feminists did in the United States and in Western society all over the world came right out of communism.
Women can get quite possessive of their kitchens. Have you noticed this?
Mm-hmm.
Like when they're hard at work in the kitchen, a lot of them don't resent it. That they get quite into their business, and if anyone comes into the kitchen, they're like, "Get the fuck out of my kitchen! I'm busy."
I'm working
even
here.
Though even though they get quite tetchy about it, they're at the same time quite possessive of it, because in a way they enjoy it.
Yeah.
In much the same way as any artist enjoys their work, they don't want to be interrupted while they're owning their craft. In a way that men have never been possessive in the same way about the jobs that they do. They're very much, if anyone wants to come in and help me, who's actually efficient and indeed proficient, they're quite like, yeah, for God's sake, come in and help me. This is difficult work, even if it's a woman. If it's a woman who's actually good at the job, and as long as they're not going to pull all this Me Too harassment bullshit, they're like, hell yeah, come in and help me. We're a team. Very ironic, given the subject of communism, that men, while they're at work, are quite willing to stand shoulder to shoulder and help each other in whatever line of work that might be. Whereas women, when they're working in the kitchen, are very much, no, don't get anywhere near my shoulder. This is my place. It's all about me. And that's very much how they want it. Not all women, obviously.
Oh, they get very competitive about it, actually.
Yes, so some women don't like that. They're in the minority, but it's not even a small minority. Some women don't particularly like the kitchen, just like a lot of men don't particularly like the kitchen, and yeah, they shouldn't be forced into it either. But they never have been. Certainly not since the Industrial Revolution. They've had the option of working in factories or working in whatever the early 20th century equivalent of an office was.
Yeah.
I don't even know what that was.
This actually would be a good point at which to mention a history tidbit. Everybody knows Typhoid Mary, the story of Typhoid Mary, the woman who, after she contracted the bacterial infection that causes typhoid fever if you get it in other people's food. The health department workers that came to talk to her about how to prevent that from happening came into her kitchen and started talking to her about the process and usefulness of hand washing, and she chased them out with a meat fork. Brandishing this meat fork, I will stab you. That was her response. Don't tell me how to operate my kitchen. So they had to put her in an institution to keep her from killing the children of any more families by infecting them with typhoid fever, because she refused to learn to wash her hands.
They didn't trust the science until the TV told them to trust, quote unquote, the science.
So, there we go. But in the 1950s, leftists started claiming that the original National Women's Day was on March 8th, 1907, and that it was held to mark the 50th anniversary of a woman textile workers' strike in New York City, and on March 8, 1857. So basically, they lied about a time period 100 years earlier that people didn't really know how to research and disprove, debunk, right? The French correctly pinpointed the day's origins to before the Russian Revolution, but they made up an even older mythological history to especially de-Bolshevik the day and make it more palatable for non-Soviets. 1967, International Women's Day is revived in the United States by a women's group in Chicago, which included daughters of American communists who remembered having heard of the holiday. Kaplan notes that these feminists revitalized the celebration and infused it with new meaning. And then, shortly after I was born, we have 1975, the UN International Women's Year codified International Women's Day as March 8th. So we have had an International Women's Year already. So I guess now there's going to have to be a Women's Decade. That's going to drag on forever. The holiday's radical political origins have been largely forgotten. And that's your history lesson for the night, guys.
That's how communism was introduced to the West. Yuri Bezmenov is sleeping in his grave. He's done a good job of illustrating how the fuck this happened.
Yep. So let's get into. We don't think we have any super chats, but we do have 2 super chows. So Meredith G before the show gave us $5 and said, HBR Talk 299, honey for the Badgers. I feel about International Women's Day or Women's History Month the way Morgan Freeman feels about Black History Month. Yeah, that's why I'm doing this discussion, debunking some of the, I guess, myth and mystery around, how great this holiday supposedly is. I think a lot of people have been unaware that it's actually just communist propaganda. Like International Women's Day and is communist propaganda. Women's Month is communist propaganda. And a great deal of what is modern feminism is communist propaganda. And pre-modern feminism had the same ideas that communists had at the same time that communists had them, whether they were influenced by communists or not.
Feminism and communism are both euphemisms, by the way. And I'm going to draw any of this to an origin that's not its real origin. It's all oikophobia. It's what happens when a society reaches the point where it's decadent enough and has machines doing most of its work at the point where it implodes. It pulls itself inside out. It can be called communism. It can be called feminism. It can be called, democracy.
Yeah.
I don't want to blame feminism on communism, or point to any. None of this can be pointed to any one particular phenomenon that any of us have in our vocabulary. They're all euphemisms for a phenomenon that is so ingrained in our society that we don't even have a sufficiently descriptive word for it. But we're starting to see what it is. It just happens to have been manifested in various things that we have euphemistic words for. Among them are feminism and communism and socialism and ESG and DEI and all them fucking modern things. Yeah.
You think of it in terms of a wrecking ball on a construction vehicle. So oikophobia would be the chain on the device, and the ball is the act of taking a segment of society and falsely accusing them of oppressing another segment of the same society. So members of your home, your community, your country, your family, your population, of oppressing other members of your same population by having success, simply having success, taking responsibility, and enjoying the fruits of their personal accountability, rather than by real means of oppression that involve taking weapons and gathering people up and locking them up and so on, putting them in camps and putting them in chains. That's oppression, right? But where you look at modern allegations of oppression in first world countries like the United States, where we have demographics that are claiming to be oppressed by the success of other demographics at exercising accountability for fun and profit. That's definitely a false allegation, and that's the ball. And
we've evolved to need enemies.
Yeah,
we've evolved this sense of fear, this sense of paranoia, which is very helpful for staying alive. But for most of our history as a species, our enemies have been saber-toothed tigers and mammoths and any other large animal that we can that we can see with all our we can notice with all our senses are actually our enemies. But a long time ago, we conquered the saber-toothed tigers.
Yeah,
saber-toothed cats, I should say. And after we conquered them, we had nothing left but other humans who were our enemies, and that's when we developed xenophobia. But eventually, we dominated the earth so much that even other humans, I guess they still, for most of ancient times, other humans were our number one enemy, our only enemy, really. But once we got as far as the Industrial Revolution, even other civilizations of humans couldn't hold a candle to that. That's why it's taken off in the West so much, because once we developed machines that could blow the smithereens out of anyone else, we were like, well, even xenophobia is not going to cut it anymore. Even other groups of humans can't touch us anymore. But we still need enemies, because we're evolutionarily designed to need to have some concept of who our enemies are. And if we can't find those enemies outside ourselves, then we're going to find them inside ourselves. And until we've taught ourselves to direct that need for an enemy somewhere healthy, this is going to keep happening. And because I was about to say, well, we have to direct it inwards, but that's not going to help either, because that's just going to create self-hatred. But I think to some degree, this is what religions are for. So you can develop some spiritual way of making of realizing that the only enemy is within. It's this ingrained need in ourselves to find enemies. That's what should be our enemy, and we should work personally and individually on fighting the enemy within ourselves, not in a self-hating way, but in a sort of self-improving way. And that's that's, I'm trying to think of a more profound way of saying that, but I think that's where it ends.
Yeah, basically, our enemy is getting into thought patterns that are dysfunctional and damaging instead of helpful. We take too many shortcuts, and as soon as we figure out one shortcut is stupid, we move on to the next shortcut. And they all work like that chain and wrecking ball combo. But the underlying chain and wrecking ball still seems to be that issue of a need for an enemy. I don't think it's easy to identify self-destruction as your worst enemy, especially when you're in the throes of it. You hit that, you end up you hit that level where you are able to do that, then you end up becoming enlightened and shit, and run around wearing a robe and hiding in the mountains. But there you go.
There's no end to this. It's just a case of juggling it,
Growing pains,
and having fun with the juggling. Learn to juggle the neurosis that exists in our soul as human beings.
Just remember, when you walk into a circus and you want to find who's to blame, go straight for the juggler. And with that, we will go on to the next. We have. Let's see, did I finish that? I did finish that one. Okay. So the one good man gave us $5 and said, "Interestingly, I didn't lose my last shred of respect for feminism until I heard an interview with Aaron Pitsey. Hated by feminists and loved by MRAs. Mike, your rant on white rage was frigging awesome."
Thanks.
And then we have the one good man gave us another $5 and said women were not allowed to fly aircraft until the 20th century. Oh, this is great. We're not allowed in space until the 1960s, and there are still no female trillionaires. I'm off to oppress my harem like the oppressive and yet pathetic incel I am.
It's important to note 100% of space crime is committed by lesbians.
That is true. So far. But I like that. And, you know, the sad thing is, in 20 years, people will be saying that, and there will be people who don't understand why it's funny. At some point, there's a list going around. I think Allison put it in our little chat for HBR Talk. That it's a list that very much needs to be debunked, and it's full of stuff that, oh, until this date, women couldn't do this thing, you know. And then you look and you realize that actually most people, male or female, couldn't, but some men and some women could. So that was bullshit. And every single item on the list has some set of details like that that make it either a bullshit claim or a claim with bullshit implications. And we'll have to go over that sometime during a show, but it's not long enough to make. I don't think it's long enough to make a whole show out of it. Watch me be proved wrong by that. But we'll see. It'll probably be after we. I don't know. Maybe we'll do. We'll finish the article we were going to finish this week, next week, and then do that the following week. We'll see. But in any case, that is all of the super chows. And we have no super chats. We have no paid Rumble rants. So I am going to call it a show. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I know this was kind of a dry episode, and we've been in kind of dry episodes. But for a while. But I think this is kind of necessary. Thanks, Mike, for sticking out. This is kind of, like I said, a dry sausage. But it was an important one. And thanks to everybody who works in the background to make HBR Talk happen. And good night, all.
See you next Thursday.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.